It's John Livingston speaking. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. We're here, my colleague and I, Rick Kahn, are here to share with you our experiences in endpoint management in OT, in securing OT. Just quick agenda for the session today. First of all, we'll just run through a quick introduction of Rick and myself. We'll be doing the webinar as well as a brief introduction of our organization, Verve Industrial. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about endpoint management from a security point of view. We'll review some of the challenges that we see existing in doing endpoint management security in OT. And then we'll talk through a case study of a client of ours who had an aspiration to really achieve endpoint security in the OT environment and how they did it, what their objective was, what the solution was, the impact, and then how it actually worked in practice. And Rick will take you through that. And then we'll kind of summarize with some key takeaways and questions. Just so everyone knows, you can ask questions throughout in the chat. So please feel free to submit those questions in the chat as we go. And then in addition, obviously, we'll reserve some time at the end for answering some of those questions live. And then to the extent that we don't get to all the questions live, we'll certainly distribute answers to others. And then there'll be a couple of poll questions as we go through here. And so the folks will explain to you how those polls will work. So just quick introduction. So I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. And with me today is Rick Kahn. He's our VP of Solutions. Both of us have a long experience. Rick's been in the ICS or OT cybersecurity industry for over 20 years. I've been the CEO of Verve for about 4 or 5 years. And before that was in the consulting industry prior to that. Verve as a company has been around for 25 years. This is our 25th anniversary. We began as a control systems integrator, and for the past 15 years or so have been focused around OT and industrial control systems cybersecurity. Our team is made up of control systems engineers. So most of our folks have spent their lives working on these control systems in an operational and security capacity. And so as a result of that, we understand many of the challenges that come to the operational side of the organization when trying to manage any kind of security, but specifically around endpoint management. For the last 12 or 13 years, we've been deploying what we call the Verve Security Center to help clients manage their endpoint security. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, but most of it is on the broader solution for this particular client. But through that experience and through that platform, we've had the opportunity to work to help bring to address some of those challenges in OT endpoint management. And then not only does the company provide the software, but we also have a range of services leveraging our ICS engineering team. So that's a quick introduction of who we are and who you're hearing from today. So we're going to start with a brief poll question. And so as we do this, it gives us some guidance as we go through the conversation today to make sure we're able to address any issues that come up throughout the day and allow us to focus it more effectively. So the question is, where is your organization in its cybersecurity journey? Number one is, we're just starting out. Number two, we've conducted assessments and we've started to begin some initial security remediation efforts against those assessments. Number three, actually, we've taken more initial security actions of a variety of sorts, but it's not yet a comprehensive program. And then lastly, the fourth option is kind of we're down the road on a pretty comprehensive cybersecurity program for our OT environments. And so the poll is open. So folks can vote there. Hopefully it's clear how you vote. Terrific. Whoops, excuse me. So we'll come back as we talk here today about some of the results of these polls and give you some feedback about that. So as we begin, what we wanted to do was to start with a definition, and starting with that definition of what is, when we say endpoint management, which is really the focus of our discussion today, what do we mean by that? And on the first word, endpoint. And so what we include when we think of endpoint management is all of the computing devices that are in your, it could be an HMI, a processor, a workstation, controller, etc. And then management, as we think about management, we think about the not only ability to see and monitor those endpoints, but also the ability to act on them. So management is not just the visibility part, but it's the ability to take actions to secure that endpoint. Those actions could be everything from patching to hardening configurations to changing settings, ports, services, a variety of different things. So when we think about endpoint management, it is the visibility, monitoring, and actions on those endpoint types that you see above. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. The reason we think about this as endpoint management, the reason we believe that endpoint management is a critical part of cybersecurity is literally just based on some of the data about cybersecurity more broadly defined, even outside of OT. So this data here comes from a source called Cybersecurity. It is a national database in the U.S. on the number of jobs in each of these types that Cybersecurity defines. And as you can see, depending on how you count the oversee and govern group, roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the jobs in cybersecurity are around management. They're around network architecture, device provisioning, identity management, patch management, vulnerability analysis, etc. We often hear about the more quote-unquote sexy things, like the stuff at the bottom, the big data analysis and the anomaly detection and the threat hunting, etc., which is all important. However, 2/3 to 3/4 of the activities of the roles are here in endpoint management. And oftentimes in OT, endpoint management is not the first thing we think about, it's the last thing, because there are challenges. And so we'll talk today about some of those challenges and how to overcome it, given how important this element of cybersecurity is. So as we flip to the challenges themselves, we hear a lot from folks in the industry about the things that you can't do from an endpoint management point of view in OT. Well, you can't patch. Devices are too sensitive, the processes are too critical, you just can't patch. You can't automate vulnerability assessments because you can't scan things. If you scan these networks, you'll potentially knock over devices and brick them, so to speak, and stop your process. You really can't do inventory because the environments are too complex and they change. They have layers of networks, proprietary devices. You really can't do inventory. We can't absorb all the additional work that endpoint management would require because of limited resources. And God knows, most of all, you certainly can't put any agents that could manage those endpoints on a control system, which sure sounds like a lot of can'ts. What we're here to do today to talk to you about is what you can do safely and effectively. And we'll take you through this use case study of how a company actually did this and achieved across all of these can'ts with a can-do attitude. There are some material differences in OT. There is an IT perspective that our OT environments are homogeneous. But the reality is that OT assets can really vary, as we all know, in the range of vintage and function. Old PLCs, old controllers don't operate with many of the same capabilities that a modern Windows 10 PC might. And a lot of the models that have been approached through IT don't really scale well in an OT world. Things like being able to push asset management from a central corporate data center all the way out to all of the devices can cause disruptions potentially. As we say, the OT team is vastly outnumbered by the number of endpoints. We don't have the resources in these sites that might be able to be available if you're in a centralized IT environment. Asset criticality is different. You just can't reboot machines. The processes are running, et cetera. And so a lot of the IT tools immediately just flipped over and applied to OT for endpoint management doesn't really work very well. And so this is a story, an example of one company who, facing those challenges, decided to address them head on and find a way through them. And so the story is that one of our clients eventually, but they started with a vision, and the chief information security officer decided that they needed a consistent approach to their IT and OT security, and that meant they needed to push to true endpoint management. This particular organization decided to adopt the CIS Top 20 security controls as its standard, and those require endpoint management. And they set a very hard deadline. They said within 12 months, we're going to achieve a certain level of maturity across all endpoints and all networks across IT and OT. And so they needed a solution that it could apply IT-like capabilities in OT. It needed to be cost-efficient deployment and, most importantly, management. It needed to have the ability to report and monitor progress across all the sites in this operational organization into one place, and then to support in developing processes and procedures for this endpoint management. So that's what they needed, that's what their objective was, and what they needed. They had a range of options of standards to choose from. I'm sure many on this call know the various standards for ICS or OT security, from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or the CIS Top 20, et cetera. The surveys show, from the SANS survey, shows that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the CIS Top 20 are the highest used here based on the survey, but obviously ISO 27001, IEC 62443, et cetera, also have a lot of folks who take those as their standards. This company, as I mentioned, took the CIS, and that can be laid against the NIST Cybersecurity Framework pretty easily. And as you see, as you go around this framework, the number of elements of this, which really are about endpoint management, having to have a robust hardware and software inventory, having to have clear access control on those endpoints, configuration baselining and management, identity management, patch management, et cetera. And even on the detection side, being able to detect changes and anomalous patterns in endpoint behavior. And so what they needed was a solution that would be able to address all of those various elements, whether it be the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or the CIS Top 20. And so the goal was to have the same capabilities that they had in IT. So full patch management across all the software in their environment, be able to harden configurations, update user and accounts, so removing dormant accounts, maintaining only the right user and accounts, users and accounts in the system, to have a full software inventory and the ability to manage software removal, software installs, et cetera, to be able to have a full vulnerability picture of the assets, but without scanning, to be able to do network configuration analysis on those network endpoints, so the routers, switches, firewalls, and to be able to have anti-malware and whitelisting and visibility into those elements. So essentially apply the same kind of things we're trying to apply in IT into the OT environment, but it had to be tuned for the industrial control system. It had to be proven safe, so no scan-based vulnerability assessment type tools. If agents were used, they had to be proven and had lots of examples with history of use on their OEM equipment. provide appropriate coverage. So it had to not just do OS-based devices, but also be able to see and have visibility into the embedded devices, ability to act and not just see. So it wasn't enough just to be able to know that a configuration was inappropriate, but you had to be able to harden that configuration, or to know that a vulnerability existed, but the ability had to be there to actually patch and address that vulnerability. And then finally, required that because of the limited resources they had, it had to be very, very efficient to use, both in terms of deployment as well as use. And so it had to have centrally, easily analyzed central reporting, but then the actions needed to be taken locally to ensure the safety and reliability of the operating systems. So that was the goal. And so the solution, and Rick will take you through this in much more detail, but the basic concept of the solution and this is basic architecture of the Verve Security Center, is an IT/OT agent that is proven on all brands of OEM equipment. And that agent is put on all of the Windows, Unix, Linux type devices. For those devices that cannot take an agent, so embedded devices, PLCs, controllers, relays, things like that, an agentless component, which will reach out to those devices in their native protocols and gather back key configuration information from those devices. And then finally, the solution integrates with all of the leading IT type tools, things like McAfee or Symantec or Carbon Black, et cetera, to provide some of the core elements of endpoint detection and response, like application whitelisting or AV type things. At a plant level, then, that data is aggregated in an asset manager. And so all of that information then gets aggregated at a plant location, let's say in a plant environment, or if it's a more distributed environment, it might be across a whole series of substations or components of a pipeline, et cetera. And then finally, all of that from each of those asset managers it gets rolled up to a central reporting console. And that's really, frankly, where most of our time today, as Rick will show you how the solution works in practice, will be spent. And that reporting console allows for centralized reporting and analysis on all of the endpoint management that's happening. And then importantly, from that analysis, then one can design the actions to be able to remediate the issues and security issues identified on those endpoints. And then through the local asset managers, those local sites can then take those actions in an automated fashion. Key to this is that it allows you to have centralized analysis, but those actions are controlled locally by the folks most close to the operation. And so the key solution deliverables for this client was it had to be 100% software based. So we don't use any hardware, expensive taps, et cetera, to capture network traffic. In other words, it was living off the land through our agent and agentless integrations. It had to provide 360 asset risk management. So as we go through this today, you'll see that one of the challenges in the environment was the number of vulnerabilities that emerge and the risks that emerge. And so there needed to be an ability to prioritize those by looking at the holistic picture of the risk of an asset. It had to be a closed loop platform. And what we mean by this is you had to be able to take those actions, not just identify the problems. What we refer to as think global, act local. So this notion of having the ability to have visibility and insight centrally so that the central team can track performance. You can scale the analysis part of which vulnerabilities are greatest, which risks are greatest, design the programmatic responses to those, but then the actions themselves are controlled at a local level so that they can be taken when a plant is offline, a particular process is available with those experts at the site. And then finally, the integration with IT tools where the client wanted to keep consistency around things like AV, for instance, or application whitelisting or backups, et cetera. So what happens when one does this? So what they were able to measure was their performance against a range of metrics against this is the NIST cybersecurity framework, and to see the improvement from a before and after. So before the deployment of the solution, and then after. And as you can see, there was a significant increase. There were some things that the solution didn't really address, things like communications, for instance, in the respond category. But the overall average was about essentially a doubling of the scores against this, which allowed them to really demonstrate that progress that they were aspiring to demonstrate. And so Rick is going to take you through exactly how we did that, how we achieved that. Just a quick summary of our first poll as you look at the second poll. So in the first poll, sorry, I'm getting a bunch of feedback there. I don't know if Rick, you're coming off mute, just 1 second. About 30% of the folks said we've conducted assessments and begun initial remediation. 29% said we're just starting out. 21% said we've taken initial security actions, but not yet into a full program. And about 20% said we're down the road on a comprehensive program. So relatively distributed across the various stages of the journey, which is interesting in and of itself. Means that lots of folks are, a lot of different places that people are in this journey. So with this second poll, we're asking about what is your number one security priority for this year? Conducting security assessments, getting to a robust, accurate, and rich asset inventory, improving patch and configuration or user management, enabling log and detection of anomalous behaviors, automating tasks, or perhaps something else. And again, we'll be back in a little bit with more information on what the folks said on these polls. But Rick, I'll now hand it over to you, and we'll go through how it is that this solution actually worked in practice.
Thanks, John. And I believe on this poll, for those who are trying to decide, you can actually hit a couple of options on this, and we made this a multi-choice, not just a single. So if there's more than one, please feel free to go ahead and jump on that. So I'm just going to change myself to the presenter, and I'm then going to share my screen. Can someone confirm that we're seeing pretty little pie charts for me? Are we seeing my screen now? John?
Not yet, Rick.
No, okay. Well, let me just try again then. Let me share. Oh, there we go.
There we are. Thank you.
There we are. Perfect. Thanks for the confirmation. So as John pointed out, this is a day in the life of a client that looked at that big, long challenge, a list of challenges and typical OT obstacles. And I want to walk through with you how they then set up that program. And if you look at CSC 20, there's three categories. There's basic, foundational, and organizational. The idea is you walk before you jog and then you run. You don't try to go straight to a marathon. And so walking through how they built this is kind of what I want to take you through here now and address some of those specific challenges. So, starting at the very beginning, CSC 1 talks about having an inventory. And inventory is a huge challenge for most OT environments. There are options, on the market that have, either been repurposed from a, maintenance perspective or, are using, the passive anomaly detection tools to listen on a wire and sort of passively gather information. But the reality is that we need, multiple dimensions of data. The problem is that it's hard to get and it's hard to maintain. So what they first did was define, a detailed, comprehensive overview of the asset that they wanted. So what I'm showing you here is an example of the hardware inventory. Now, the hardware inventory it's needed for the result to be what I call full coverage of both north, south, and east, west. So what that means by that is east-west is pretty straightforward. We want to make sure we hit all vendor labels. Bringing an OEM certainly understands the most about their own platform, but often their coverage stops at that particular subset of assets, and you're left with supporting and ancillary systems that need to be looped in some other way. The other concern with many devices, especially with the passive tool, would be that you aren't getting what I call the north-south coverage down to relays, PLCs, controllers, any serially connected devices that are behind a gateway. You're never going to get those, and those do also have critical components to your safe operations, but also potentially some risk. So the solution then for this client was to deploy the agent-based approach on OSs and an agentless profiling of everything else. This gave them a very comprehensive view of all of their assets, OS-based, network-based, as well as embedded equipment across all of their vendors. They had multiple legacy bits of equipment across multiple units and physical locations, but they also decided that they wanted to dial in the frequency. So this is an automated update. This is something that refreshes at whatever interval, and part of their inventory requirement for maturity was having this updated every 15 minutes so that they could be able to detect new changes, adds, moves, and changes on their subnets within an hour. That was their time frame. They set out to build a robust and detailed inventory. They wanted it automated, and they needed full coverage. So what we're showing here is the concept of multiple sites showing different asset classes or breakdowns. They're able to slice and dice the data into OS types. So as they get into lifecycle planning or security updates and information, they can drill right in, for example, to Windows 7. You simply click on any of these filters, and you click on any of these that become a filter, lets them drill right into specific data. Very, very rich asset inventory here and an ability to slice and dice any way they want. They also can look by classes, by manufacturer. So for example, you want to get into Rockwell or Schweitzer or Brocade, you can simply drill into any of these. I'm going to show you by clicking on the Rockwell just for fun what sort of access and information they've now had at their fingertips. So here we are drilling into Rockwell. We can see they have very specific PLCs, hardware models, serial number, OS versions, and all of the attending data that then took what was otherwise a very difficult challenge and made it very, very automated, insightful, and powerful. And as you can see, we get right down into very specific information about all these assets. So that was a great win. They now at least have a starting point for what they have for assets installed, where they are, what their version is, their hardware, the serial number, et cetera. So from there, they decided, well, we need to do CSE2 as well. So they built a software inventory. And again, passive tools would capture that which is communicating, but not necessarily that which is installed. And of course, many people are very familiar with the concept that in a typical FAT or a project upgrade, we go and we install new software. Maybe we've got a new alarm management or loop tuning platform we want to deploy. And to look at the ladder logic or the outputs, we need to install Excel to look at the tables. The challenge there is that quite often the entire Office suite gets installed, and maybe we don't need that level of information or those types of applications, which introduce more risk. So in conjunction to the hardware inventory, the same agent and agentless is able to enumerate all manner of software by version, by type, et cetera. And as part of their monitoring, and looking at what shouldn't be on there, we're able to build sub-filters for them. They built their own sub-filter to look for software that they felt was quote unquote questionable. So in this case, we're seeing a lot of Angry IP and advanced IP scanners, but we're also seeing potentially a need for some training and awareness. The Bonjour service, as everyone's aware, or most people are aware, is an Apple service. So it looks like we've got some guys plugging Apple phones into HMI port or USB ports on HMIs. So great insight, not only from the hardware, but into software. And we've completely pivoted what is traditionally a very, very difficult first step to grab the information, but even more so a maintenance issue. I mean, this client did have, a paper database that they were starting from, but it turned out that we were 591% wrong when we went in and did a walk down and saw it was actually at that facility. So two really big wins in terms of granularity and access to information, and that information just continues to build. So for example, the next thing this client did was to satisfy, I think it's CSE 7, vulnerability management. They took the National Vulnerability Database and they layered it over top of their database. Now, this approach is far superior to traditional methods because at the moment, many people in the OT space are forced to use either periodic vulnerability assessments where people actually come and profile the system and look at known issues and give you a report. That report is very static in ages. or we're challenged with having to use scan-based tools. Of course, scan-based tools can be very invasive, can knock systems offline. And so the challenge of using those is you need to either dial them down, or you can only do them on a subset of assets that are very robust, or you only do them during outage or turnaround when it's okay if you accidentally knock something offline. All three of those completely diminish the value and the frequency or the freshness of the data. This approach, by contrast, says here's everything, and this inventory and their particular configurations are updated every 15 minutes. So taking the National Vulnerability Database as an example and layering that over top of real-time data on your assets means you've got real-time risk data as well. And so what we're able to see here is risk by location. One location is very good at having almost no critical risks, others not so good. We're able to see the impact of the specific CVE on those particular assets. Availability impact is often a very large concern for many organizations. So risks that pose a complete availability loss are key and should be elevated. A network attack type, in some cases, the client's looking at layer 2 of the Purdue model and a network-based attack vector being very low likelihood, and so discounting the number. But the value here is they've gone from what is a hit or miss and a very periodic or stale or aging type of vulnerability assessment and management program, i.e. consulting, or very risky and dangerous scan-based tools into real-time navigable risk data at their fingertips on their assets. And this context is very, very significant. So then they turn their attention to users. How many accounts do we have? How many are administrator accounts? How many have been inactive? If they've been inactive more than 180 days, maybe we don't need them. Expired passwords, maybe they're not yet hit the inactive scale, but their passwords are expired. Impact of assets. One of the things that we put in here, and John mentioned it, 360-degree scope, is that we not only take the asset information, but we pull third-party data, whether it's the National Vulnerability Database or whether it's, like you said, whitelisting and backup status. We also put it in front of the operator and say, Mr. Operator, which of these assets are critical? Because not all assets are created equal. And so understanding which assets have a high impact to safe operations, and of those high impact assets, how many of them have inactive user accounts or admin accounts that haven't been changed or used, really helps us to not only focus on where to start, but really illustrates our understanding of our environment and where our risk truly is. So then they turned, once they'd sort of built hardware and software inventory, vulnerability and patching requirements, they're enumerating users. They then turn to, as most people need to in OT, compensating controls. And what I mean by compensating controls is you often can't patch, but you should do something, you can't do nothing. So in OT, we always have to fall back to what other controls and levers can we pull? In CSC, they call it a golden image or a hardened image. There's different language and different standards. The basic premise is least privilege. And so what we have here is we've built from the CSC 120 recommendations, there's about 100 specific compliance checks that you wanted to monitor for least privilege best practice, like administrator account being renamed, remote access to guest being disabled, different information. And so we built all of these controls in conjunction with this client. And as soon as the client deployed the agent, every single one of the endpoints checked in and measured against those least privilege or best practice configurations. And so they were able at a glance to see not only the actual controls here, which I had sort of the sublist up for, but they're also able to see by any individual asset how well that asset is doing. So for example, this particular desktop is only 28% compliant with the suite of 71 controls. So they've gone from, the challenge of everybody says, we don't know what we don't know. The inventory, the question around just getting started or, have some basic foundations in place for, I think, about 50% of our audience here today. I'm quite sure you're nodding your heads that it's, that first bit of information around inventories is a great start, but it's really the additional detail, the context, how much work do we have, where do we need to direct our attention, and how do we get into it? So if this is the informational phase, I just want to take a minute and show you what they then did was, with all of this information, how did they start to make heads or tails of it? So I want to this is how we started to guide action. One of the things John had talked about was this is a closed loop system. So we're not just reporting and saying, hey, your place is on fire, good luck, go buy your fire extinguisher. We're actually helping with the here's where your issue is. Now let me help you take action on it. The agent allows for very granular control on the endpoints. It allows for deploying of OS-based patches, but we can also uninstall or install software, remove users, or we can tune these very 71 parameters on an individual asset by asset basis and have it report up into the reporting console. So great, I can take action. Where do I start? I'm going to go back to the vulnerability page for this. When you think about vulnerabilities, this particular this list of risks is not uncommon or completely unheard of in an OT environment. It's important to note that I don't have 583 individual critical risks. This is my cumulative score of critical risks times number of assets that have that. Nonetheless, this total number is approaching 20,000 risks that I need to be concerned with if I'm operating this environment. How do I direct action? Well, let's start to apply some filter and some context. This is where the 360-degree view becomes super important and very quickly differentiates this particular approach that this client took towards being active and targeted and very, very efficient, highly efficient. So the first thing I've grayed out some options here, but really all I have to do is if I click on critical, I'm going to set a filter, a subset of these assets to just look at the critical risks across these assets. Obviously, the number is still fairly high. That doesn't change. But what we can do in the name of context is I can start to add those other 360-degree markers or the other asset characteristics that help me prioritize. So the first one would be, if you remember, I said we put this in front of the operators and say, give me the context. What is this asset? What's its importance level? Is it high impact to operations? Is it low impact? So if I wanted to just look at critical assets with a high impact, I would just filter high impact assets that have a critical risk. And you'll see that we quickly narrow down from 500 to 130. Now, it doesn't mean that those other 400 and some aren't important, but it means that maybe they're not what I need to deal with before I leave for the end of the week on Friday. This 134, though, is still a pretty big number. And you can see we got a number of different assets, and the resulting list is right down here with the asset name and the actual risk that's ranking for it, which CVE. So you may want to be able to filter by these, whether it's network-based attack vector, low complexity, or it's very complex, whatever. But another quick measure that we could do is I've got 134 assets that are considered high impact with a critical risk. Let's look at the last bastion of defense. How many of these actually failed their last backup? Okay, so I do not necessarily have a fallback plan for this next set of assets. I've now narrowed down to 17 high impact assets with critical risk that don't currently have a backup. To me, this is exactly the number, the list, the hit list that goes to the very top 10 and need to be addressed with immediately. And this helped them very quickly go from what is typically noise. We don't know what we don't have. Now that we know everything we have, the numbers are astronomical. How do I make heads or tails of that and prioritize this? How can I show that this is the most important thing to go after? And so we use this sort of metric either within vulnerabilities, or we also have the ability to build baselines just in a pure patching perspective, i.e. approved by the vendor versus not, and sort of filter that way. But the idea is that the data is great to collect and collate, but it's even more powerful once you take it and pivot that information into directing action, guiding projects for remediation. You can know instantly with this couple of clicks here just how big the problem is and how many people you need to throw at it or how important it needs to be in your to-do list. Now, John's going to talk a little bit more when I throw the microphone back as to how we organizationally structure a remediation team and how a technology like this really enables and fortifies that. So I'm not going to steal too much of his thunder. But what I did want to do is sort of pivot beyond the action taking, which again we're going to cover, and go then to the monitoring. It's one thing to build it and set it up. It's another then to take that and start to action. But how do we measure our progress and see where we've come from and how far we still need to go? Here's a quick example. This is what we call the CSO Dashboard. This is a combination of the different data sources we were just looking at vulnerabilities and exposure score. And we did it, we created a couple of custom measurements that incorporated not only raw risk, on the asset as well as in the wild as reported by data sources like the National Vulnerability Database. But we also put, an operational context and a risk level that helped this client understand where they wanted their risk level or their risk appetite to sit at. And so what we're seeing here are just a few examples of that. Critical vulnerabilities in total, there's 583, which is a big number, but you see this organization, based on the number of their assets, this is still pretty small. They built these thresholds to show how they feel they need to keep their critical vulnerabilities and where they are relative. These can be completely adjusted to your organization. They can be scaled per the number of assets, et cetera, et cetera. They chose this one. Anything under 1,000, they think they're doing pretty good. The second, though, was average asset vulnerability score. So taking the vulnerabilities and dividing by the number of assets gave us an average. And this client is looking a little bit in the middle here, 6.5, but still not in the danger zone. They're creeping up on it, but again, shows them exactly how they're doing. Getting down to IT assets versus manufacturing assets, they chose to split stuff that was more core in layer 3.5 and stuff that could be a little more automated with pushing patches and not such a robust testing environment potentially. And they could push them faster. And so they have a number of critical patches on IT, but also they split out the very fragile, high touch, high importance, kid glove sort of handling, what they call manufacturing assets. And you can see they're doing a little bit better here. They're still in the green versus the yellow. They also chose to look at, critical patches by quarter. So is the threat increasing? Is the patching decreasing? But the idea in either case is to show how they're trending. And then, of course, the configuration compliance, as I was showing you. So how are they doing with those compliance measures on the least privilege? And how are they doing with managing and watching for unwanted or unique software? So here you can see they're looking at more specific Office-based stuff, as well as Java and different browsers that they may not want on endpoints and HMIs. So that's sort of an overview of information, how information can be automated and provide granular and very targeted insight, how that insight can start to direct action, and then as we go forward, how this client is also monitoring and reporting on this capability. At this point, I want to throw it back to John to kind of run through a little bit of the framework of the organization, how this fits into an organization, and then save a few minutes, hopefully, for questions. We seem to be getting a fair bit of interest here. So, John, I'll throw it back to you. I'll mute myself so you don't get feedback. John.
Terrific. Thank you, Rick. Yep. Thank you, Rick. Just didn't want to get us competing on the volume there. Hopefully we've pivoted the screen and folks can now see my PowerPoint screen again. As Rick mentioned, there are organizational requirements that come from this as well. So to conduct endpoint management appropriately, the last thing we want to do is to have every one of the plants or substations or gas terminals, whatever it is that you're working with, to have subject matter experts in endpoint management. And so what the platform allows clients to do is to structure this in a way where you have a centralized group of subject matter experts around networking, around developing compensating controls, around building up specific remediation advice, et cetera. Then at the next layer down, to have scaled analysis and automation with playbooks, et cetera. And then to have at the local level, really the people who are there, plant IT folks or INC techs or whoever it happens to be, who understand those particular systems, but aren't going to be the cybersecurity experts. And so what happens with the platform is at the top, all of the data that Rick was just showing you can be analyzed by that central group of subject matter experts. They can build those playbooks, as Rick was mentioning, around the actions, around patching, or around removing software, et cetera. And then the local teams at that local level, all they're really needing to do is to be able to test those maybe on their system, make sure that there's no impact to the system, and then to at the right time to execute those actions in the playbook. And so what what the platform allowed this client and lots of other clients to do is to allow for a scaled way to organize for endpoint management in OT. So just in summary then, before we get to questions, there is no question that the concept of true endpoint management, OT security, more broadly defined, it really sounds daunting with all of the things you supposedly can't do around asset inventory and patch management and agents, et cetera, et cetera. But we have, we've taken through one example. There are lots of others we could have taken you through which demonstrate what really can be done on endpoint management, and to have an effective IT OT program where you get the same kind of endpoint management capabilities and security within your OT environment as you do in the IT environment. To do so, however, does require a clear aspiration and leadership. There are challenges that will emerge, right? There will be pushback around things. But the good news is there's lots of case studies out there that can be pointed to say, no, this is very feasible. And it really does require, though, something that addresses these obvious and clear challenges that come up. Something that can gather that robust and efficient inventory without the need for a lot of hardware and or scanning of assets, et cetera. The ability to see, as Rick showed you, all that data in one place so you can make the trade-offs, because there will be a lot of trade-offs of how you're going to manage a particular asset. Efficient deployment and management, so to be able to reduce the costs and particularly the labor requirements in what is already stretched organizations. The centralized reporting with the local control, and then finally, something that allows you to take actions and not just identify issues. So with that, that sort of ends the formal presentation part. We wanted to make sure we left time for questions for people at the end here. And so I guess I'll turn it back over to our moderators to moderate the questions as we go forward.
Thank you, John. This is Renee Bassett again from automation.com. And I want to remind all of our attendees that we are taking questions. The questions tab is on the right-hand side of the screen. We had a number that have come in already, and you're welcome to provide more as we go along here. And we will answer as many as we can in the next 7 to 10 minutes to keep the overall presentation time to an hour. So one of the first questions, and John or Rick, you can decide who will be answering what. But one of the first questions I got was, what is the install footprint for the product? The questions include agents on the endpoints, VM on site on the plant or appliance, enforcement points. What's installed?
Sure. So I can take that. As Rick mentioned, on each of the OS-based devices, think of those as Windows, Unix, Linux type things, we do deploy the agent, which is a very, very, very light footprint agent. We've been tuning this thing for 12 or 13 years. So essentially think about it as like the calculator app on your phone. It's that small. So those would be deployed. We would then have essentially a couple of VMs. Those VMs are optional in terms of where we put them. So in some environments, so think of a manufacturing environment of consumer goods, or a refining type environment with multiple refineries or power generation. We would likely put our VM infrastructure at each of those individual plants, one at each plant, basically. We would then have a central VM, which would typically sit at a data center of that client. Now, all of this can also be deployed in the cloud. So it's all cloud enabled. And so we can run both the Verve Asset Manager, as we described, which is typically the local VMs, as well as that central reporting console in the cloud, if preferred by the client. And some of our clients do that, and many of our clients are more traditional and put it on-prem. So those are the fundamental elements. You've got the agent on an endpoint. You've got the VMs, which run our agentless solution, as well as our aggregation, et cetera, and our action capabilities. And then you've got the reporting VMs up at the top.
Gotcha. Thank you. A related question is, someone asked, what database are you using?
We use multiple different databases. So we're using SQL in some cases. At the plant site, we have a NoSQL database. What Rick was showing you was a NoSQL database at the top.
Gotcha. Another question. Oh, go ahead.
John, just advance the slide to show the contact info, please, if you don't mind. We do have another couple of webinars coming up. You can get to them on the Verve event page if you're interested. And there's John's and my contact information. If we don't get to these, we will be sending out answers to all of them, of course. But if anybody wants to have a deeper dive, please feel free to reach out. Sorry, John, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, perfect. Rick, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Another question is, what industrial protocols are supported with your agent active scans?
Let me take that one, John.
Yeah, so
okay. So we actually don't need to do protocol inspection. We often get asked, are you doing passive packet inspection? We're not. We do support multiple communication methods depending on the asset end type. So, for example, Rockwell now supports CIP, the Common Industrial Protocol. So we use CIP to enumerate the Rockwell chassis and all the cards in it, as well as the backplane. Conversely, if we're going to talk to something networking or communication gear, it's usually SNMP v2 and soon to be v3. We also have the ability on more legacy, traditional embedded stuff to be talking directly to, for example, Schweitzer gateways via SNMP, Telnet, SSH, you name it. The agent itself is only on the OS-based devices. It communicates from the endpoint to the database with private generated certificates and encryption. And so that's more of a proprietary thing, but in no cases do we need to actually interpret and unpack protocols or reverse engineer their communication path. So we don't need to know Modbus, for example. We can go directly to the endpoint and pull it in its administrative language. Anything I missed there, John?
No, that's enough.
Okay. We have a question that asks, in an OT environment, there is no internet. How are patch updates, CVE updates done?
I go ahead and answer that. So we have essentially an air-gapped proxy approach. So it depends on the exact architecture that you're employing. But for instance, some of our clients are as disconnected as having a data diode. And so what we do in those environments is we've got a proxy set up that gathers and pulls it down inside the customer environment. And then if it's in a diode situation, that is then we have a thing called an air gap tool, which allows us to essentially download those onto our server and then sneaker net it across into the environment if necessary, or alternatively to bring it over across a secure protocol if that's necessary. Importantly, all of our communications with those agents is done inbound to outbound. And so the agent communicates outbound to the server and basically think of it as saying, do you have anything for me now? And then the server will respond to what the agent requests. So there is no inbound port needed to be opened into the environment to make this work, even for the pulling of the patches.
Understood. You may have covered this question earlier, but just to be clear, the specific question is, how do you collect information about control devices on the network? The questioner says, I'm assuming you don't deploy any agents on PLCs themselves.
Correct, right. So that is where we use our agentless capability. So for our, we have these two different pieces, right? So for the devices that can take an agent, which is an OS-based device, we do put the agent on there. But for those where they, like PLC, a controller, a relay, a networking device, that's where we have our agentless connectors, which reach out and connect to those devices to gather the information.
Understood. And are you supporting all ICS vendors systems at this time? Yokogawa, Emerson, Honeywell, Schneider, the full gamut?
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And anything, if for some reason there's a, it always, there's always some random weird device out there. I say 100%, and I need to be a bit careful. It takes us about 2 weeks to write a new connector. If for some reason there's some strange device out there that we don't connect to, but it's a pretty rapid process to add the new one.
Yeah, I just want to expand on it a little bit. So the agent can go on any type of OS as far back even as Windows XP. So most of the HMI engineering stations of all the major vendors are pretty immediately covered. What John's referring to is more the embedded stuff. So come up against a very particular PLC we may not have seen before, or a relay of some sort. But everything that we use today for everything we're doing, i.e. the scheduler, the parsing tool, the collection and retrieval and storage in the database, the presentation up and reporting, it's all reusable when we come up against a new device. As John pointed out, it's just the last mile talking specifically what are the formats and fields, can we do telnet versus SSH, et cetera. So it's a very quick, a rapid onboard of additional assets should we run up against something we haven't seen before.
Understood. We did have a question about the licensing model. And the question specifically is, what is the model and how can we estimate a cost to implement?
The licensing model is done in general by the number of endpoints. So it's priced in large part based on the number of endpoints, and obviously there are volume levels in all of that and buckets of endpoints, et cetera. How can we estimate the cost? Frankly, probably the best thing to do is to contact us to get us some particulars. Mostly it's about how many endpoints, the basic architecture you're talking about. Is it one site? Is it 50 sites? And then third would be, we'd probably talk through a little bit which functionalities exactly are you looking for. But those are sort of the three things you pivot off of to get to a price tag.
Mm-hmm. Another question: do you have any advice on how you would get started in that regard? Like, how do you prioritize how to start? Which endpoints to address, that kind of thing.
Yes. So absolutely. So the way we typically begin this is the first step is to go and put in the platform to gather the asset inventory. And so the process typically is we'll go in, we'll put our virtual machine in, and immediately that's gathering back an initial inventory. The next step then is to deploy the agents on the OS devices. Those agents, as Rick mentioned, act as little sentries in the networks, and so therefore get us a really good picture of all of the assets in the environment. And then the third step is to go and actually start connecting using our agentless connectors with all of the embedded devices. And so typically the process is, initial view based on the VMs, then the next view is going to those OS devices, and then the third step is typically then extending out to all the embedded devices. But getting that asset inventory is first and foremost always the priority. Rick, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think you summed it properly, John. That's good.